Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, thanks. The towering sequoias loomed over the restricted zone like ancient sentinels, their thick branches twisting together to block out the sun. Ranger Eric Tate adjusted the strap of his rifle and surveyed the dense woods ahead. Most people thought of Yosemite National Park as a place of serenity, where natural beauty flourished undisturbed. For Eric, it was something else entirely, a battleground. He had been a ranger for nearly a decade, but it wasn't until 2 years ago that he was offered the job of guarding Area 12. Officially, it didn't exist. The restricted zone wasn't marked on any map, and no tourists ever set foot within its boundaries. The government called it a wildlife conservation area, but Eric knew better. His job wasn't to protect the wildlife, it was to keep it contained. After months of grueling training in tracking, survival, and firearms training and tactics, Eric was sent here with 2 rules. Nothing gets out, and anything suspicious gets reported immediately. Over time, he learned that suspicious covered a wide range of horrors. Area 12 was home to creatures that defied logic. He'd seen things that haunted his dreams, elongated shadows that moved against the wind, eyes that glowed like embers, and shapes that dissolved into mist when pursued. He clicked on his handheld GPS. The boundary was close, marked by a series of buried motion sensors and reinforced fencing camouflaged among the trees. His sidearm, a Glock 19, rested on his hip, but it was his AR-10 rifle he trusted most, a reliable weapon with enough stopping power to handle anything that got too bold. Eric paused as his radio crackled. A familiar, clipped voice came through. "Tate, status check." "Boundary secure," Eric replied. "Nothing to report yet." "Keep it that way," the voice said before cutting out. Eric sighed. The agency wasn't much for small talk. They gave orders and he obeyed. He understood the stakes. If even one of the cryptids escaped, it could spell disaster for the public and for him. Movement caught his eye. He raised the rifle, scanning the underbrush through the scope. A deer burst from the trees, its chest heaving. Eric lowered his weapon, but his relief was short-lived. The deer staggered, its sides streaked with fresh claw marks. It collapsed, legs twitching, and was still. Eric's muscles tensed. Something had spooked it, and it wasn't far. He approached the carcass cautiously, rifle raised. The claw marks were deep, too large for a bear or a mountain lion. The tracks leading away were even stranger, wide, with 3 elongated toes that dug deep into the soil. His earpiece crackled again. "Tate, report." "Possible breach near the northern boundary," Eric said. "Investigating now." "Proceed with caution." Eric nodded to no one in particular and tightened his grip on the rifle. He wasn't just dealing with wildlife here. He was dealing with cryptids, and every instinct told him this was only the beginning. Eric followed the tracks deeper into the restricted zone, his boots crunching against the forest floor. The claw marks gouged into the earth were irregular, as though whatever made them had a loping, uneven gait. He felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Years of experience told him one thing. He was being hunted as much as he was hunting. The forest thickened, the sequoias growing denser, their roots rising like skeletal fingers from the earth. The air seemed heavier here, charged with an unnatural stillness. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. Even the wind held its breath. Eric stopped abruptly. A faint noise reached his ears, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. He dropped to one knee, scanning the area through his rifle scope. Between the trees, a shadow moved, too large to be a deer and too silent to be a bear. It stopped just out of clear view, the shape obscured by the underbrush. "Come on," Eric muttered under his breath, keeping his aim steady. The shadow shifted, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of it. A creature with mottled, grayish skin stretched tight over its angular frame. Its arms were unnaturally long, almost dragging on the ground, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting a dull orange light. Eric's heart thudded in his chest as he recognized it from the briefing files. A skewer, one of the cryptids known for its speed and predatory instincts. It lunged. Eric fired without hesitation. The crack of the rifle echoed through the forest, and the creature snarled as the bullet hit its shoulder, staggering it. It scrambled back into the shadows, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. Eric fired again, the second shot ripping into a tree as the creature disappeared. He stood, his breathing heavy, scanning the forest. He didn't dare follow it deeper into the restricted zone. Not yet. Instead, he checked the tracks. Blood spattered the ground, thick and black with a pungent metallic odor. It was wounded, but not enough to stop it. Skewers were known for their resilience. He'd read reports of bullets failing to kill them outright unless they hit vital points. Eric keyed his radio. Tate reporting, skewer sighting confirmed. Wounded but not neutralized. Boundary still secure. The reply came swiftly. Understood. Reinforce your position. Priority is containment. Containment. Always containment. Eric knew what that meant. He was on his own. Reinforcements never came unless the situation was catastrophic. The growling started again, louder this time, coming from his left. He swung the rifle around, scanning the dense underbrush, but the sound stopped abruptly. The skewer wasn't alone. Eric tightened his grip, his mind racing through his options. If they were coordinating, they'd try to flank him. He shifted his position, keeping his back to a large tree trunk, and switched to his Glock for closer quarters. His training kicked in, instincts honed by years of dealing with dangerous predators. The forest remained silent, but Eric knew the calm wouldn't last. The hunt was far from over. Eric steadied his breathing, his Glock held at the ready. The forest remained still, but he knew better than to trust the silence. Skewers were clever. They didn't attack outright. They tested, prodded, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The sensation of being watched prickled the back of his neck. He scanned the shadows, searching for movement, but nothing stirred. Then, in the distance, he heard it. The faint, rhythmic beeping of a motion sensor tripped near the northern boundary. His stomach dropped. A breach. He moved quickly, holstering the Glock and raising his rifle again. Navigating the forest was second nature, his footsteps silent against the moss-covered ground. As he approached the perimeter, the faint hum of the buried sensors grew louder in his earpiece, signaling where the breach had occurred. A section of the reinforced fencing lay in disarray, its metal strands torn apart as if by immense force. The claw marks etched into the posts confirmed his worst fear. More than one cryptid had been here. "Damn it," Eric muttered, crouching to examine the ground. Tracks crisscrossed the area, some leading deeper into the restricted zone, but others heading toward the open forest beyond the boundary. He placed a hand on the earth, feeling the residual warmth of something that had passed through not long ago. He keyed his radio. Tate reporting, northern boundary compromised, multiple tracks leading out. "Estimate the number," his handler replied, the usual calm, clinical tone masking any hint of concern. "At least 3. 2 heading deeper into the zone. 1. Eric hesitated, tracing a set of prints that veered sharply westward. 1 is outside the boundary. The response was immediate. "Neutralize it before it breaches containment further. Priority 1. Eric didn't need to be told twice. He was already moving, following the tracks westward. The path was erratic, the prints doubling back and circling, as though the creature were testing him. He kept his rifle raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. Whatever had escaped was dangerous, and if it reached populated areas, the consequences would be catastrophic. The tracks led him to a narrow ravine bordered by jagged rocks and thick underbrush. The dense vegetation made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Eric's pulse quickened. This was a perfect ambush site, and the skewers were known for their cunning. A low, guttural growl echoed through the ravine, the sound bouncing off the rocks and making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Eric froze, scanning the area through his rifle scope. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision, a blur of grayish skin darting between the rocks. He aimed and fired. The bullet struck stone, sparking off the rock face. The creature let out an enraged screech and launched itself from the shadows, its grotesque form fully visible now. It was taller than Eric had anticipated, its limbs grotesquely elongated and tipped with claws that glinted in the dim light. Its mouth opened in a snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Eric fired again, this time hitting its chest. The impact sent the creature stumbling backward, but it didn't fall. It lunged at him with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air. Eric barely managed to sidestep, swinging his rifle like a club to knock it off balance. The creature hissed, retreating a few steps, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Blood oozed from the wound in its chest, but it didn't slow down. Eric steadied his aim, his sights locked on its head. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the creature crumpled to the ground. Eric exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. He approached cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on its unmoving form. The creature's chest no longer rose or fell, and its eyes had dimmed to black. It was dead. He keyed his radio again. One skewer neutralized, boundary compromised but contained for now. "Good work," his handler said. "Reinforce the area and continue patrol. Containment is critical." Eric looked at the torn fencing in the distance. This was only the beginning. Something was stirring within Area 12, and he wasn't sure he was prepared for what came next. Eric worked quickly to patch the torn fencing. It wasn't a permanent solution, but the temporary repair would slow down anything else trying to escape. The reinforced steel cables were designed to withstand the force of the creatures, but something had managed to tear through them as if they were little more than thread. That realization gnawed at him as he fastened the final cable and surveyed the boundary. The forest was still unnervingly quiet. He glanced at his watch. The sun would set soon, and night patrols in Area 12 were exponentially more dangerous. Most cryptids became bolder in the dark, their movements faster, their hunting more calculated. As he finished his repairs, his radio crackled with static, followed by an unfamiliar voice. "Anyone on this frequency? Hello, we're lost." Eric froze. Civilians. His blood ran cold at the implications. He pressed the button to reply, his voice firm. "This is Ranger Eric Tate. Identify yourselves." A man responded, his voice strained with panic. "We're hikers. We got off the trail hours ago. My wife's hurt, twisted her ankle. We saw some fencing and thought we could cut through to find help." Eric's jaw tightened. "That's a restricted area. Stay where you are. I'll find you." "No, you don't understand. Something's out here with us," the man said, his voice dropping to a frightened whisper. "We saw... I don't know what it was, but it's stalking us." Eric felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The breach earlier hadn't just been dangerous for the public. It had already drawn victims into the zone. He grabbed his gear, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and switching on his GPS. "I'm on my way. Do not move. Stay together and stay quiet." The radio went silent, and Eric set off toward their coordinates, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor. Every step brought a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the hikers that worried him. It was whatever had lured them into Area 12. The hikers' signal was weak, distorted by the dense canopy above. As he drew closer, he noticed signs of their presence: a discarded water bottle, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. But there were other signs, too, subtle impressions in the dirt, the faint stink of decay hanging in the air. Whatever had breached the boundary was tracking them. Eric quickened his pace, his eyes darting between the trees. The light was fading fast, the shadows lengthening. He activated the flashlight mounted on his rifle, its beam cutting through the gloom. "Hello?" a voice called out faintly from ahead. Eric recognized the man from the radio. "I'm coming to you. Stay calm," Eric called back. As he crested a small ridge, he saw them. A man and a woman huddled together against the base of a massive tree, their faces pale and drawn. The woman clutched her ankle, a makeshift bandage wrapped around it. Relief flickered in the man's eyes when he saw Eric, but it was short-lived. From the shadows behind them, something moved. Eric raised his rifle instinctively. "Get down," he barked. The man froze, his mouth opening to protest, but Eric didn't have time to explain. He fired a warning shot into the darkness, the crack of the rifle echoing through the trees. A guttural snarl answered, deep and resonant. The hikers scrambled to the ground as Eric stepped between them and the advancing shadow. The creature emerged, its grotesque form illuminated by the flashlight. It was similar to the skewer he'd killed earlier, but larger, its muscles rippling under its mottled skin. It moved on all fours, its claws digging into the earth with each step. Eric fired, the bullet slamming into its shoulder. It let out a roar of pain but didn't stop. He fired again, aiming for the head, but the creature was already charging. "Run!" Eric shouted, pulling his sidearm as the beast closed the distance. The hikers hesitated for a moment before scrambling to their feet and fleeing into the forest. Eric stood his ground, unloading the Glock into the creature as it lunged for him. It staggered, its momentum carrying it past him and into a tree. He turned, firing the last round into the base of its skull. The creature collapsed with a heavy thud, its body twitching once before going still. He reloaded quickly, his breaths coming fast. In the distance he heard the hikers yelling, their voices receding into the trees. He keyed his radio, his voice sharp. Hikers found, target neutralized. But deep down Eric knew this was far from over. Eric trudged through the forest, his steps deliberate and silent despite the urgency thrumming in his veins. He needed to find the hikers before another cryptid did. The forest was fully cloaked in darkness now, the faint glow of his rifle-mounted flashlight, his only guide. Every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He knew he couldn't stay here for long. The cryptids would be regrouping. The hiker's trail was easy to follow. They left a clear path of broken branches, disturbed foliage, and smeared blood from the woman's injured ankle. Eric muttered a curse under his breath. They were practically a beacon for anything hunting in these woods. His earpiece crackled and he immediately halted, pressing himself against a tree. A deep, guttural growl reached him, not from his radio but from somewhere ahead. He crouched, slowly advancing, his rifle raised. The flashlight beam swept across the forest floor, landing on a strange formation of rocks and dense underbrush. Something about the area felt wrong. As he approached, Eric saw the signs, twisted branches arranged in unnatural patterns, charred patches of earth, and bones, animal and human alike, scattered like grim confetti. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and his stomach turned. He had found their lair. At the center of the clearing was an entrance to a cave, its mouth jagged and black, as if the earth itself had split open. The hiker's trail led directly to it. Eric's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a cryptid lair, it was the center of their activity, a place they clearly defended fiercely. He clicked his radio. Tate reporting, found a probable cryptid nesting site, evidence of multiple casualties, including human remains, proceeding with caution. "Do not engage unless necessary," his handler replied, the static-laden voice devoid of emotion. "Reinforce the boundary and retreat if needed." Eric grimaced. Reinforce and retreat? That wasn't an option if the hikers were inside. He couldn't live with leaving them to their fate. Tightening his grip on his rifle, he pressed forward, his flashlight slicing into the cavern's shadowy depths. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The walls were slick with some kind of viscous substance that glistened in the light, and the ground squelched under his boots. Piles of bones were stacked haphazardly, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum that set his teeth on edge. A faint, pitiful sound reached him, whimpering. Eric moved quickly, following the sound deeper into the cave. His flashlight revealed the hikers huddled together near a far wall, their faces pale and streaked with tears. The man spotted Eric first, his eyes widening in desperate relief. "Please," he whispered, barely audible. "It's still here." Eric raised a hand to silence him and scanned the chamber. The hum grew louder, and a shape emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, crouched low to the ground with a sleek, sinewy frame. Its eyes glowed with the same dull orange light as the others, but this one was different, more intelligent, more calculating. It let out a growl that seemed to reverberate through the cavern, its claws scraping against the stone as it advanced. Eric aimed at its head and fired. The bullet struck true, but the creature barely flinched, its gaze fixed on him. "Move," Eric barked at the hikers, motioning for them to run. They hesitated for only a moment before scrambling past him toward the cave entrance, Eric kept his rifle trained on the creature, firing shot after shot as he backed toward the exit. Each bullet tore into its flesh, but it showed no sign of slowing. He was almost out of the cave when the creature lunged. Eric dropped to one knee and fired a final round directly into its gaping mouth. The creature reeled, its body convulsing as it collapsed. Black ichor spilled across the cavern floor, pooling at Eric's feet. He didn't wait to confirm the kill. He turned and sprinted after the hikers. Emerging into the open air, Eric found the hikers trembling just beyond the clearing. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice firm. "Follow my lead." They obeyed, and together they made their way back toward the boundary. Eric's mind raced. If this was just one lair, how many more were hidden in Area 12? And what would it take to truly contain them? Eric guided the hikers through the forest with quick, purposeful steps. His senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the oppressive darkness. The skewer lair wasn't far behind them, and there was no telling how many more creatures were lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. The injured woman stumbled, letting out a sharp cry of pain as her twisted ankle gave out. Her husband caught her, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "We can't go any faster," he said, his voice trembling. "She's hurt." Eric glanced at the treetops, his flashlight flickering over the dense canopy. He could feel the creatures watching them, their predatory gazes pressing against his back like a physical weight. Time was running out. "We stop, we die," Eric said, his voice cold but not unkind. "Put her on your back if you have to. We need to move." The man nodded shakily and hoisted his wife onto his back, grunting under her weight. They resumed their pace, slower than Eric would have liked, but better than staying still. His mind raced as he mentally mapped the path back to the boundary. If they could reach the fencing, the sensors might buy them enough time to radio for an extraction. A guttural snarl pierced the night, low and rumbling, coming from somewhere to their right. Eric spun, raising his rifle and scanning the darkness. His flashlight caught a flash of movement, a pale, elongated limb disappearing behind a tree. "They're flanking us," he muttered. "Keep moving, don't stop." The hikers obeyed, but their pace faltered as the snarls grew louder and more numerous. The creatures weren't just hunting, they were herding. Eric realized too late that they were being funneled into a trap. The forest opened up into a clearing, the ground littered with jagged rocks and twisted roots. The hikers hesitated, but Eric pushed them forward. "Go, the other side of the clearing, now!" As they ran, the skewers emerged from the tree line, their grotesque forms illuminated by the moonlight. There were at least 4 of them, their glowing eyes fixed on Eric and the hikers. They moved with unnerving speed, their limbs contorting as they bounded over the uneven terrain. Eric dropped to one knee, aiming his rifle at the nearest creature. He fired, the bullet striking its chest and sending it sprawling to the ground. Another charged from the left, and he swung his rifle around, firing again. The creature staggered but didn't fall, its claws slashing at the air as it closed the distance. The hikers reached the edge of the clearing, but the woman's screams cut through the chaos. One of the creatures had darted ahead, blocking their path. The husband tried to shield her, but the skewer knocked him aside with a swipe of its massive claw. Eric didn't hesitate. He drew his sidearm and fired 3 quick shots, each one hitting its mark. The skewer let out a piercing shriek before collapsing. Eric rushed forward, pulling the hikers to their feet. "Run!" he shouted, his voice cutting through their panic. "I'll cover you." The remaining skewers circled the clearing, their movements deliberate. Eric backed toward the hikers, firing controlled shots to keep the creatures at bay. His ammo was running low, and the creatures seemed to sense it. They grew bolder, darting closer with each pass. One lunged, its claws slicing through the air. Eric ducked, slamming the butt of his rifle into its head and firing point blank into its chest. The creature fell, writhing, but another was already behind it. Eric fired again, the recoil jarring his shoulder as the shot tore through its shoulder. "Keep going," he yelled over his shoulder. "Don't stop." The hikers disappeared into the tree line, their ragged breaths fading into the distance. Eric stood his ground, his rifle trained on the remaining skewers. They hesitated, snarling, their glowing eyes reflecting their frustration. Eric knew they were testing him, waiting for him to falter. His radio crackled. "Tate, report. Boundary breached, engaged multiple hostiles," he said, his voice strained. "Hikers extracted, returning to boundary." "Understood. Maintain containment." Eric gritted his teeth, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Easy for them to say, sitting in some distant control room while he faced death head-on. He fired one last shot into the air, a warning to the skewers, before retreating into the forest. The boundary was still a mile away, and the hunt wasn't over yet. The sound of his boots pounding against the forest floor mingled with the distant growls of the skewers trailing him. Eric kept his pace steady but purposeful, scanning the shadows as he moved. The hikers were ahead of him, their frantic breathing and occasional stumbling the only signs of their progress. The fence boundary wasn't far, but Eric knew they weren't safe. Not yet. "Keep moving," he barked, glancing back to ensure the creatures hadn't closed the gap. The skewers were relentless hunters, but they also calculated their attacks. They weren't rushing. They were waiting for an opening. As the hikers crested a small hill, the faint metallic gleam of the boundary fence came into view. Relief flickered across their faces, but Eric didn't let his guard down. He motioned for them to stay put while he approached the fence, his rifle at the ready. The motion sensors were intact, their subtle hum reassuring, but the tension in the air told him the cryptids weren't finished. "Climb over," he said, motioning toward the hikers. "Now." The man helped his injured wife up first, her hands fumbling for purchase on the metal as she dragged herself over. Eric kept his rifle trained on the tree line, watching for any sign of movement. The man followed quickly, his landing on the other side clumsy but effective. Eric gave a sharp nod. "Stay low and keep moving along the perimeter. Follow the markers back to the ranger station." "What about you?" the man asked, his voice trembling. "I'll catch up," Eric replied curtly, his attention already shifting back to the forest. The skewers appeared as if conjured by the growing darkness. 3 of them slipped from the shadows, their glowing eyes locking onto Eric. He adjusted his stance, taking a deep breath as he aimed his rifle. He fired once, the shot hitting the lead creature squarely in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall, letting out a guttural snarl that sent the others surging forward. Eric dropped to one knee, firing in quick succession. The second skewer fell, its grotesque limbs twitching as it crumpled to the ground. The third lunged, its claws slicing through the air inches from Eric's head. He rolled to the side, firing his sidearm into its exposed flank. The creature howled, collapsing in a heap, but Eric knew there were more. His radio crackled again, the familiar detached voice of his handler cutting through the static. "Tate, status." "Boundary reinforced," Eric said, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. 3 hostiles down, but the activity's escalating. Something stirring them up. There was a brief pause before the voice replied. "Return to base. Debrief immediately." Eric hesitated. The agency rarely called him back unless something significant had shifted. He glanced at the boundary, ensuring the hikers were well on their way, then turned and began retracing his steps toward the base camp. The ranger station was a small fortified outpost hidden deep within the restricted zone. Eric entered through the reinforced door, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights greeted him, along with the low, steady beeping of monitoring equipment. A man in a dark suit was waiting for him, his expression unreadable. Eric had seen him before, a handler from the agency, always brief and vague. He was the kind of man who never gave more information than was absolutely necessary. "You found their lair," the man said, his tone devoid of surprise. "Yeah, and a lot more than that," Eric replied, setting his rifle on the table. The hikers stumbled into the zone, and something's pushing the cryptids closer to the boundary. The handler nodded, as if this were expected. "Activity has been increasing for months. We've theorized the skewers are adapting, possibly communicating." Eric frowned. "You're telling me they're getting smarter?" "Not just smarter," the handler said. "More organized. They've been testing the boundaries. This breach wasn't random. It was a coordinated effort." Eric felt a chill run down his spine. "And you waited until now to tell me?" The handler shrugged. Your job is containment. Knowing their tactics doesn't change that. Eric stared at the man, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. If they're evolving, how long before containment isn't enough? The handler's expression darkened. That's why you're here, Ranger Tate, to ensure that doesn't happen. The conversation ended as abruptly as it had started. The handler handed Eric a new set of coordinates, another section of the zone requiring reinforcement. The message was clear: no rest, no reprieve. Eric returned to the forest, his mind racing. The agency knew more than they let on, and the cryptids weren't the only thing he was beginning to distrust. Eric moved through the forest with a renewed sense of purpose and unease. The coordinates given by the handler led to a remote section of the boundary he hadn't patrolled in months. This area, deeper within the restricted zone, was rumored to be home to the largest concentrations of cryptids. If the skewers were testing boundaries here, it meant one thing: they were preparing for a mass breakout. The wind picked up as he approached the designated area, carrying with it the sharp metallic scent of blood. His boots crunched against the ground littered with broken branches and tufts of fur, evidence of a recent struggle. Eric activated the motion sensors near the boundary, their faint beeps confirming activity nearby. The forest was alive with movement. Shadows darted between trees, the sound of claws scratching bark echoing in the stillness. He felt their presence before he saw them. The skewers were gathering, their guttural growls and snorts blending into a chorus of predatory hunger. Eric stopped at the base of a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The boundary fence stretched across the terrain, its reinforced steel cables glowing faintly in the moonlight. Beyond it, dozens of cryptids were emerging from the trees. The skewers moved like a pack of wolves, their elongated limbs twisting as they stalked the perimeter. Behind them, hulking shapes lingered in the shadows, larger, more grotesque creatures Eric had only seen in agency briefings. These were no ordinary cryptids, they were something far worse. He keyed his radio. Tate reporting, "We've got a serious situation. Multiple hostiles at the southern boundary. They're testing the fence, preparing to breach." The response was immediate. "Do not let them breach, Tate. Reinforcements are unavailable. You're on your own." Eric swallowed hard, suppressing the anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. Typical. He was always alone when it mattered most. Adjusting the scope on his rifle, he zeroed in on the lead skewer, a particularly large one pacing near the boundary. His first shot rang out, the crack of the rifle breaking the stillness. The bullet struck the creature's chest, sending it sprawling. The others reacted instantly, their glowing eyes snapping toward him. They let out unearthly shrieks and charged toward the fence, claws tearing at the ground. Eric fired again and again, each shot finding its mark. The boundary sensors flared as the creatures slammed into the fencing, their claws raking against the reinforced steel. Sparks flew as they tested its strength, their collective weight pressing against it like a tidal wave. The ground shook as one of the larger cryptids emerged from the shadows, a massive, lumbering beast with thick, mottled skin and jagged protrusions along its spine. It roared, its deep, resonant bellow vibrating in Eric's chest. This was no skewer. It was something far worse, and it wasn't stopping at the fence. Eric reached into his pack, pulling out the emergency explosives he'd been issued for last-ditch containment. He set the charges along the ridge, positioning them to collapse the valley entrance if the creatures breached the boundary. The skewers were relentless, their claws tearing into the fencing with unnatural strength. The larger cryptid barreled forward, its immense bulk bending the steel cables. "Come on, you bastard," Eric muttered, firing at the massive creature's head. The bullets barely slowed it, glancing off its thick hide like pebbles. It reached the fence, its claws wrapping around the cables and ripping them apart with a deafening screech. Eric triggered the explosives. The valley erupted in a fiery explosion, the shockwave knocking him off his feet. Dirt and debris rained down as the ridge collapsed, sending massive boulders crashing into the valley below. The fence crumpled under the weight, and the cryptids disappeared beneath a cloud of dust and rubble. Eric scrambled to his feet, coughing as he surveyed the destruction. The valley was sealed, the boundary reinforced by the natural barrier of fallen rocks. The motion sensors beeped faintly, signaling the absence of movement. For now, the cryptids were contained. He keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the chaos. Tate reporting. Breach contained. Valley sealed with explosives. Situation under control. The handler's voice came through, as emotionless as ever. Good work, Ranger Tate. Return to base for debriefing. Eric stared into the valley, his grip tightening on his rifle. The creatures would regroup, adapt, and try again. Eric trudged back toward the ranger station, his body aching from the explosive shockwave. His uniform was torn, streaked with dirt and sweat, and the adrenaline that had kept him sharp through the encounter was fading fast, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The forest around him felt eerily calm now, the aftermath of his desperate stand leaving an unnatural stillness in the air. The hike back to base was grueling, every step a reminder of the narrow escape he and the hikers had just endured. He thought of them, terrified but alive. He had done his part, even if the agency's priorities weren't always clear about saving civilians. Containment was their mission, but Eric couldn't ignore the people caught in the crossfire. When he reached the station, its reinforced steel door glinting under the dim light of the moon, he punched in his access code and entered. The stark interior, all metal and concrete, felt suffocating after the open forest. The hum of the monitoring equipment filled the space, accompanied by the faint crackle of static from the station's communications console. He sank into the chair at the desk, his rifle resting across his knees. The radio crackled, and his handler's voice came through. "Tate, we need your report." Eric sighed, running a hand through his dirt-streaked hair. Breach was significant, at least 20 skewers and something else, bigger, stronger. It tore through the fencing like it was paper. There was a pause on the other end before the handler replied. "Describe the larger entity." "Built like a tank," Eric said, his tone grim. "Thick, spined hide, claws like goddamn steel hooks. My rounds barely slowed it. Took explosives to bring it down, and even then I'm not sure it's dead." Another pause, then, noted. "Reinforcement of that boundary section will be prioritized." Eric let out a bitter laugh. "Reinforcement? It's rubble now. The only reason it's holding is because the ridge has collapsed." "Containment achieved," the handler said flatly, as if that solved everything. Eric leaned back, his exhaustion giving way to frustration. "You knew this would happen, didn't you? You've been tracking the increase in activity, the coordination. Why wasn't I told?" "Our job is to ensure containment, not to share unverified data," the handler replied. "You performed as expected." "As expected?" Eric snapped, his voice rising. "I'm out here alone fighting things you won't even name, and you can't give me a straight answer about what the hell is going on." The handler's voice remained calm, almost unnervingly so. "Your position is critical, Ranger Tate. You understand the importance of the work. If you'd like to terminate your contract, we can arrange for a replacement." Eric stared at the radio, the weight of those words settling on him. Terminate his contract, leave Area 12 in someone else's hands. He thought of the hikers, the breach, the growing intelligence of the cryptids. He couldn't walk away, not when he was the only one standing between those creatures and the outside world. "Keep your replacement," Eric said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." "Understood," the handler replied. "Your next assignment will arrive shortly. Rest while you can." The radio went silent, leaving Eric alone with his thoughts. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, and stared at the map of Area 12 pinned to the wall. Red markers indicated previous breaches, their frequency increasing in recent months. He traced his finger along the southern boundary, now sealed by his explosives, and then to the deeper sections of the restricted zone marked only with vague warnings. What was in those uncharted areas? The agency knew, but they weren't telling. And yet they relied on him to keep the cryptids contained, armed with only what little information they deemed necessary. He shook his head, feeling the weight of the impossible task settling on his shoulders once again. After a long moment, Eric stood, grabbed a rag, and began cleaning his rifle. The familiar ritual calmed his mind, grounding him in the simple, practical actions of maintenance. He wasn't here to understand the cryptids or the agency's secrets. He was here to do a job. And as long as the creatures stayed in Area 12, he'd keep doing it. The sun rose slowly over the treetops, its warm light filtering through the thick canopy and casting long shadows across the forest floor. Eric stood at the boundary, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The reinforced steel cables and buried sensors were intact for now, but he knew it wouldn't last. The cryptids never stopped testing, never stopped searching for a weakness. They were relentless. He shifted his stance, wincing as a sharp pain lanced through his ribs. The injuries from the previous night were minor compared to what they could have been, but they served as a stark reminder of how close he had come to failure. Failure, in his line of work, didn't just mean death, it meant catastrophe. Eric's radio crackled. "Tate, status check. Boundary secure," he replied. His voice was steady, betraying none of the exhaustion he felt. "No movement." "Understood. Continue patrol." The line went silent again, leaving him alone with the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped hesitantly, their calls gradually returning as the chaos of the night faded. Eric found himself envying their ignorance. They didn't know what lurked just beyond the trees, what monstrous shapes prowled the shadows. But he did. He walked along the boundary, his steps methodical, his eyes sharp. Every so often he stopped to check the motion sensors, ensuring the system was functioning properly. The explosive collapse of the valley had bought them time, but the cryptids would adapt. They always did. As he moved, his mind wandered to the hikers. He had no doubt the agency would ensure their silence, either through intimidation or something more final. That was the cost of containment, secrets kept at any cost. He'd done his best to save them, but he wouldn't see them again. That was just as well. The less they knew about him, the safer they'd be. Reaching a small clearing, Eric paused, his gaze drifting to the dense forest beyond the boundary. The shadows there seemed deeper, darker, as if the trees themselves were conspiring to hide what lay within. He thought of the skewers, of the larger creature that had nearly torn through the fence, and of the unexplored regions of Area 12. What else was out there, waiting to test the limits of his endurance? He didn't want to know, but he would find out. That was the job. Eric adjusted the strap of his rifle and turned back toward the ranger station. The agency would keep sending him to reinforce the boundaries, to patrol the woods, to face down the horrors that humanity wasn't ready to know existed. And he would keep answering the call. Not because he trusted the agency, but because he understood the stakes. If he didn't do this job, who would? Back at the station, he cleaned his weapons, patched his gear, and prepared for the next call. He knew it would come soon. The cryptids weren't finished, and neither was he. As the shadows deepened once more over Area 12, Eric stood ready, a silent protector armed with a rifle, a sidearm, and the resolve to hold the line. Whatever came next, he would face it, because that was what the job demanded.